All right, we are live. Welcome to Conscious Conversations with Nick Palladino King and Nitin Garg. We've got Laura Furman with us today. Laura is a product manager / yoga teacher who blends her knowledge of yoga and experience as a product manager to help people perform better in the workplace. So, Laura, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, Laura, would you like to kind of kick it off and tell our listeners a little bit about you, a little bit about what lights you up, and then maybe a little bit about what we are going to dive into today and see where this conversation takes us?
Yeah, that sounds good. And thank you for the intro. So, like Nick said, my name is Laura. I've been practicing yoga for 10 years, teaching it for 6, 7, I don't know, they kind of blend together at this point. But what really lights me up in this moment is actually surfing. So, a new COVID hobby that I picked up in the last year and a half, where I found it just really refreshing, not only because the ocean is ice cold here in Northern California, but also starting something that I was really, really bad at. Like not knowing where to sit, how to catch waves, like really having to learn from basic safety to more strategy and technique and how to find the right board and how to read the conditions. Like there's so many threads that you can unravel within it. And I found it really interesting to just dig deeper without expectation of needing to be the best at something. Because I think a lot of us are in this mind frame already where we're used to doing things that we're reasonably good at. So starting something where you're really starting from zero, I mean, maybe not zero. I knew how to swim. That is kind of foundational.
I was going to ask that.
That would be truly starting from zero.
Yeah, not 0, but 0.5, let's say. But it was really refreshing to start from somewhere where I had almost no knowledge and be able to notice more as I was on the journey.
What made you kind of lean into a challenge like that?
I think I'd always had an aspiration to surf, but I grew up in Massachusetts, so didn't really have an opportunity, and then was kind of dreaming of it. But the funny thing about surfing in Northern California is there's kind of a threshold of if you don't know how to surf at all, you're probably going to have a pretty crappy time because you're going to end up sitting in the water and freezing your butt off for 3 hours. But if you learn somewhere warm and then come to California, it's kind of more worth it because you actually can catch waves and enjoy yourself and not be just thinking about how cold you are. So I had the opportunity during COVID with work remote to go live in Mexico for a month and work from there. And that's where I was able to actually get to a threshold of, okay, I'm competent enough that I can go and despite the cold water, still enjoy myself.
That sounds perfect. It seems like that should almost be like a career tip,
Yeah.
Take an aspect, go practice somewhere where it's a little bit, less taxing, and then come and try the hard waves after that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, there's something that you said, Laura, that I really liked is that that we all have, many of us share the tendency, I think you said more or less, to want to be really good at something initially. And so I was noticing, so the other day I was researching a hobby for myself and I was like, oh, why don't I get into martial arts? Okay. And the first thing I started doing was researching what's the quickest black belt to get. Like, is it karate? Is it judo? Is it Aikido? And I was like, holy crap, I haven't even started this thing yet. And I'm already trying to find out how quickly I can be good at it and how quickly I could be the best at it. And I just thought that was such a good insight for myself, but it also sounds like you've seen this in yourself and maybe in some other people. So I just had that realization last week. So maybe you want to touch on that, how that's showing up for you or where you see that showing up in your world.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at one point I would describe myself as a chronic overachiever. Like everything I did, I had to be the best at. I think that especially in the Bay Area and other places where like your profession really defines how you think of yourself, whether or not that's right, no judgment, but you go to a party and the first question someone asks you is, what do you do? Not, who are you? What do you like? even who do you know at the party, like straight in networking all the time.
Wait, I thought that was the normal way to start a conversation, but that's probably because I've been here forever.
It's such a pet peeve of mine. I feel like it really does not matter unless I'm at a networking event what your job is. And it's just a way for somebody to kind of size you up quickly. And, you know, it all has to do with identity. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is having an identity as somebody who is good at everything, or having an identity as somebody who is an overachiever, or is a product manager, or is a CEO, or whatever else it is. It's like, are you that thing? And if that thing were to go away, who would you be? I think that's more interesting. Like, what is the container?
Yeah, like the identity that we define for ourselves, right? And how we choose to talk about it, what aspect of that identity we walk into the room with, choose to lead with. It's interesting for me, especially because I feel like every month that goes by, that answer gets more complicated. You know, it used to be simple. I would just say I'm a product manager at Intuit, and now it's like, well, I also do coaching and I do this other thing, and like, all right, which piece of it do I want to talk about? So that's it. But yeah, the question still very much revolves around, like you're saying, Laura, you know, especially if you're in an environment where people tend to gravitate towards that question of what do you do? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Such an identity piece. And it's also, you know, if that's your highest thought when you're doing an activity, that's going to define your experience. So if Nick, your intention is I'm doing karate so that I can be a black belt, every other aspect of doing karate is not as high a priority as becoming a black belt. So the way that you practice it, are you enjoying it? How many hours a week are you doing it? Like, every facet of that experience is pointed towards achieving something versus, you know, if that's your intention, that's great. I mean, go be a competitive karate black belt, no judgment. But with surfing, like, I'm not going to be an Olympic surfer, which, shout out, surfing's now in the Olympics as of Japan, which is pretty cool. My goal was to have fun, de-stress from work, feel like I got out of my apartment. And in order to do that, I don't need to be aggressively moving down boards until I can get on a short board and rip and ride in barrels. Like, I need to be able to just catch some waves and have fun.
It sounds like, Laura, what you're saying to reflect back is our identity limits our reality. Like, our identity limits, maybe better so said, is like our identity limits our experience. So if your goal is to be the best, then your identity is going to be limited through that. So is your experience. But if your goal, like what I heard you say, is to have fun and to enjoy yourself and de-stress, when you said that, it felt like a world of possibility kind of opened up. And I think surfing's a great example. We could be talking about yoga, karate. We could be talking about, you know, your first job out of college, right? I mean, what's defining the goal, or maybe even deeper, defining the intention, is what I hear you saying. Is that about right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Your intention in any practice is going to define how you experience it. And is your goal to be the best, or is your goal to have a good experience? Those aren't mutually exclusive, but they will change how you approach it.
Yeah, and folks can be so like goal oriented, right? That it's often that's the first thing we jump to is like, okay, if I'm choosing to commit this activity and this much time, like, what's the goal that I'm working towards? Versus it could be just like, hey, I'm just doing this to enjoy, learn something new, and have fun. So, Laura, I'm really curious now that we're having this conversation, because you talk about this thing of you talk about this concept or art of being a beginner. How do you typically explain that to someone? I'm really curious how you actually talk about it.
Yeah, you know, I'm probably a beginner at talking about the art of being a beginner. So we'll give it a shot. This is my first podcast appearance. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So, you know, present moment. I think it really has to do with figuring out why you're doing something, and then dropping all of your expectations. I know, Nick, drop your expectations to the floor, something you say a lot. I think when you put so much pressure on yourself to perform a certain way, that's when you create the possibility of failure. So if you set up your expectations in a way that there is no failure, then you're probably going to have a better experience when you go into it.
Yeah, you're likely just going to be more joyful and not as stressed out about did I perform to X threshold or not. Of course, the contrary, if someone was really going for like, they actually wanted to be an Olympian surfing, then of course you set your goalpost. But yeah, going in with that clear intention of what do I really desire out of this activity.
Yeah, and I love, Laura, the piece you threw in about the dropping your expectations to the floor, or our mutual teacher Gene Mazet will say throw your expectations out the window. And expectations lead to disappointment. It's a really important thing for us to understand, especially like you said, living in the Bay Area and being successful and having these large egos that we may not even be aware of. Expectation leads to disappointment because it sets a bar which has to be hit, right? And one of two things happens. Either I exceed the goal, and then what happens is, well, next time the goal gets raised, the bar gets raised, or I don't hit the goal, and now there's a gap between what I thought was going to happen in reality, and that's where disappointment, frustration lives. And I think on the other one is where burnout lives, and where lack of fulfillment lives. And you had heard Laura say present moment, and how we get to present moment is by throwing expectations out the window, dropping assumptions, and living in the here and now. And Laura, I loved what you're saying about, if you're going to go out and surf, there is no expectation. The intention is to have fun. The goal is to de-stress, but that's not the expectation, because I don't know about you guys, I've had some things that have been very frustrating to me in my life. Things that have been, that you could classify them as failures. And those end up being some of the greatest learning moments as a result. It's like success lives in failure, but I don't even like to use that word. I think feedback is the better word over than failure, because that's really what we're talking about now. Laura, for you, how do you approach then, as a beginner in surfing, as a beginner teaching beginner's mind, how do you approach a session? Is there things you do to get yourself ready to drop an expectation? Is that something that you've just trained yourself to do? I mean, what does that look like? I mean, we get it because we live in that world, but could you explain that to the listeners of how do you actually get present? How do you actually clear your mind to be a beginner?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first off, checking in with your intention of, why am I doing this? Like, am I going out because I'm training for an Olympic event, or am I going out just to de-stress and relax? And then I think actually once you are doing the thing, it's all about being present and focusing on each individual wave and each individual moment. And then also deciding, if you are using, there are, fitness trackers, and you can count how many waves you got, and it's kind of cool to see progress and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, like, every single wave is different than the wave before, than any other wave you've seen. Like, this idea of perfection or being the best kind of has this notion of rigidity to it, where I think being a beginner or being in the present moment allows you to be fluid, allows you to adapt and see every moment as being something that's unique, and every wave as something that's unique, which I think is really helpful in surfing, because particularly around here where there are a lot of beach breaks, so the shape of the wave is dictated by the surface underneath the water. Sand tends to move around, so it's never the same on 2 days, even going to the same beach. It's not like there's a rule of thumb of like, this is how you surf here, this is the takeoff spot, this is how quickly you're supposed to pop up. Like, everything is very present moment. You need to be watching, reacting, focusing, like watching the waves come in is a meditation, because your focus needs to be 100% on the waves. So I think surfing kind of forces you to do that. But if you weren't in a situation where you were forced to be present moment, that's what I would recommend bringing to the table with beginner's mind, is all these assumptions or things that you've experienced in the past doing this thing that would lead you. Can you drop that and actually assess moment to moment what you're supposed to do?
Yeah, you're like kind of adapting as you're as you're going along, because you are, you're learning. And it's interesting, actually. One of the words that was popping up in my mind as you were describing that was just adventure. You're new, you're doing something new, there's a lot of input you're taking in, you're processing, because you haven't, it's not like I've been riding a bicycle for 3 years and it's just the same. And the balance of the bike comes right away, and the pedals are just spinning because you've been doing it over and over. When you're trying something new, there is that sense of adventure. And it's actually, I mean, at least for me personally, I remember that's actually one of the most like fun times. It is challenging when learning something new. There is that little bit of a risk element. You are having to pay super close attention. It was the same thing when I did first learn how to bike. But at the same time, that activity also leads to like so much growth, a sense of like just learning something new, gaining a new skill. Yeah, there's just that adventure that goes along with it as well, which is so fulfilling in of itself.
Yeah. And I'd be curious too to hear when it comes to cycling or anything else, like when have you noticed your brain forms the strongest memories? Because typically things that we categorize as being new to signal to our brain to produce the hormones that help us cement memories more. So treating every moment as new is going to improve your ability to remember it.
I mean, I remember actually, now that you asked that, a vivid memory of me almost crashing into my neighbor's yard as I was trying to figure out how to stop this bicycle that I had just learned how to balance. So I knew how to balance it, didn't know how to stop it. And that memory is forever cemented in my brain. So you're 100% right. There is something about the brain catching on to those initial memories.
Well, and then there's such a great piece there now that you both just introduced is one I heard, Laura, you're saying is the more present we are, the better we learn.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like there's more like a fresh canvas, let's say, for lack of a better word. And then Nitin, it's what I'm hearing you say is now that, well, your skills had only gotten you to riding a bike, right? You hadn't developed the skills yet to then stop. And I think that's such an important piece for us to remember when we're learning. It's like, oh, and we'll do this with coaching work, right? It's like someone's like, oh my God, I've never not been stressed at work before, right? And they're like, holy crap, this is amazing. And then the next time you see them, they have a freak out because they didn't know how to keep that state, right? And it's like, let's not forget, the first time you do anything is the first moment you've experienced that in your entire life. So you don't know how to stop. You don't know how to stop and then start again, right? You don't know how to do a wheelie. You don't know how to jump a curve. And these are all incremental learnings that happen over time through feedback. And I mean, gosh, that's so much more fun to look at things in that way, right? In that lens of, oh, I've never gotten this far. In yoga, we call it adhikar, which you both know, right? You earn the right to learn, or you earn the right to know, okay, you can meditate. Now try visualization. Now try breath work. Now try, whatever. So there's such a fun piece here of learning, of continuous improvement, continuous learning. And you get the next piece when you're ready for the next piece. You don't learn it in one day. They say mastery takes 10,000 hours, I believe. It's a good chunk of time. But yeah, that's such a fun piece to think about. And the bike is the perfect analogy, the perfect metaphor.
And usually, sometimes there's like an aversion to start something new.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of people out there, they've probably had a hobby or some interest in their mind for the longest time, but haven't jumped in because either it was the time or maybe a risk of being perceived a certain way. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Laura, how you talk about it, but I'd be curious to hear your point of view on, when someone is considering trying something new for the first time, how to sort of help get over that initial bit that might be holding them back.
Yeah, I get this actually all the time. I'm sure, Nick, you hear this too, with people saying, I'm not flexible, so I don't want to do yoga.
Yes, classic line.
Yeah. For all the dudes out there who can't touch their toes, this one's for you. First, I tell them yoga is not about being flexible. And second, I tell them there is no good or bad. So as long as you're doing yoga, you are equal with everyone else who's in the room. And at the end of the day, if you're just breathing and focusing on your breath, you're doing it. So it's very, very simple to break it down into its smallest piece and then make it, what is the smallest piece of it? I'm sure you know this, decomposition from a product engineering background. What is the smallest piece you can break it down to get to its essence, where you're in a container that's like impossible to fail? Like if you tell someone to do an hour of yoga every day in order to be able to do a handstand in a year, right? This is a external facing goal with a time requirement. That's Nick and his black belt. Like it's going to take a while. There's a big commitment. I don't know if I like it. I don't know if it's worth it to me. But when you decompose it down to something that is A, impossible to fail, and B, captures like the essence of the intention, then it becomes a lot more approachable. So breathe and notice your lungs expand. You're doing yoga. Like that's it.
Since I don't live in the world of product management like you two, but I'm super interested in what you were just talking about, Laura, of this decomposition piece. Like, can you explain more of, like, what could that look like for someone to break something down so much that there is no possible way to fail? Like what could that look like? I don't understand this with this world, so I'm really interested myself in what that could look like at work or with a relationship or with anything really.
Yeah, Nitin, do you want to talk about decomposition, or should I jump in?
Sure. So for all the product folks out there, and for maybe folks that don't, work in the field of tech, decomposition, unlike, we're not talking about compost, we're not talking about, your veggies becoming decomposted fertilizer, but in the coding world, what is often referred to as, there's a large chunk of code. It's really gnarly. Maybe folks have been writing it for 5 years or so, and it's just this really like complicated thing. Sort of like how you might refer to Nick, like, hey, what does it mean to earn a black belt? Well, there's probably a ton that goes into it, and it's just this gigantic goal. Decomposing in that sense is referring to saying, okay, well, how can I break down this milestone into many, many smaller digestible chunks? So what's the first recognizable milestone on the way for someone to earning a black belt? And maybe that's like 1 out of 100 steps that it would take to actually get to a black belt. And then focusing on that first step. It's kind of like, Nick, when we even talk about, someone establishing a really gigantic mammoth goal, and the thought of that, something 10 years, 20 years out, when we challenge folks to think about like their dream life or their ideal role, etc., it becomes really daunting because they're like, man, that's nowhere near where I am today. How do I think about this? So we say, okay, well, what's the one small immediate step you could take next, right? So we decompose it for them to that one tiny step. I'll pass it back to you now, Laura.
Yeah, nailed it. That was exactly, the way I understand it is we break things down into component pieces that are achievable and understandable, so that we're not dealing with a lot of complexity. And this is, how we code, how we write JIRA tickets, but also how we can approach doing any new thing of, can you break it down into a piece that's so small that it seems approachable? So with the yoga case, just breathing is pretty approachable. I hope everyone is capable of breathing. But if it's surfing, it's like, all right, get in the water, or figure out what type of wetsuit you need, or start catching waves on your belly. You don't even need to stand up. Like small pieces that little by little you can put them together, and then you're eventually surfing.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that myself. I was like, okay, if I was to try and surf, I'd probably be in a pool with my board, just to be like, okay, can I stand up on this thing first in a pool that's actually calm, let alone like waves running in? That might be like later on.
Yeah. Or, land training is a huge thing with surfing. I think, particularly for people like me who can't get to the ocean every day, like, what are you doing on land that's setting you up for the water? So practicing your pop-up, practicing, any sort of balancing exercises, like Bosu ball push-ups, things with TRX, like reverse crunches, basically working on an unstable surface on land is a really good way to train for that.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And what I love about this is, and I think I've told both of you this before. It's like I see the two of you being so much more in touch with the professional world than like myself, for example, right? Because you both live in that world. But what I love is that you both live in this technical world and you also live in the spiritual world. And what I was just listening to as the both of you were talking was you both describing something pretty complex and breaking it down into something digestible, that someone could listen to this and say, wow, I could do that at work. Like I have this really big project that seems daunting, or we're going to do this brand change, or we're going to, I'm going to go from being a manager to a director, whatever. And through your guys' framework, I feel like someone could really hear that and go, oh, what's the first thing I can do? Can I start to research this? Can I start to talk to colleagues and get some feedback? Can I start to prep for, the next thing? So I just really want to acknowledge both of your ability to be highly technical and break things down into a way that I think is super digestible. And I think we need more of that. You've both heard me say, I think we have enough yoga teachers at the front of the rooms. We need more yoga teachers in businesses, as teachers, in government, So I just love hearing the two of you talk about breaking things down in technical ways that we can all really understand, in physical ways, spiritual ways. I think we could really apply that framework to learning anything. So super cool to hear. Thanks for enlightening me on that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, especially, like in the product world, often there's a case of you're handed this like gnarly project or milestone to go hit as a team, and you've got like 50 things to figure out to get there. It's so easy to get overwhelmed, get anxious, really, frankly, even get frustrated at yourself or the team when there isn't much progress. So one of the key skill sets is actually the ability to be able to break things down in a way that gives you and your team like, a sort of check-in milestone, 2 days out, a week out. So you kind of know sooner rather than later, are you off course? And therefore you can get guidance from your manager or your peers to like get back on course, right? Because we're all dealing with ambiguity. I mean, in the land of product management, it's usually the project you're on is never something someone's done before. If they had, it would be kind of meaningless for you to do it because there's already a great solution out in the market. So yeah, that ability to break things down is super, super key, and also becomes a great way to actually manage stress, because it's the inability to break stuff down that often, at least from what I've discovered, leads to that sense of getting overloaded, feeling stressed out. I don't know, Laura, if you would describe it the same way, but would love to hear your take as well.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of sources of stress: inability to break things down, ambiguity, feeling like lack of control or autonomy, like all things that I've experienced and heard from people that I've worked with on stress management. I think there's another interesting aspect of beginner's mind and product management, which has to do with just figuring out what you're going to build. Like, one of the things I really love about being a product manager is there's no instruction manual. Like, the company is trusting you to recommend what the customer needs. And if you approach it with a sense of, oh, I've been here before, I know what the customer need is, or I am the customer, and so I obviously know what the customer need is. I see that happen, all over the industry and product. Happened a lot when I was in the retail industry too. Like, I am the avatar customer, and therefore my taste is what is going to work. When you're approaching it as, I'm an expert, you're not leaving room to hear what the customer is actually asking for. So that's this idea of like continuous discovery and product development is the same thing as beginner's mind, as present moment. Like, all these things are kind of a muscle, developing your listening ability, your paying attention ability, because maybe what the customer is asking for is different than the internal shared opinion. Like, if you kind of skip that step of having present moment awareness of what the customer needs, then you could end up building something that ultimately doesn't work.
And what that reminds me of, Laura, is, I remember in my early product management days, I was trying to put myself back in that beginner's mindset. was, hey, am I approaching this thing from the way PM fundamentals are taught?
Mhm.
Because there isn't necessarily a solution sheet for every problem you face, but there are a whole host of best practices,
Yes.
right?
So many.
Oftentimes, for example, just to name one of them, you would get a business executive saying like, "Oh, this team just needs to go do X." But if you're a strong PM, you would know what that means is you better make sure that X is the thing that the customer really needs and is actually
Yes.
going to solve the business problem, because otherwise the executive is just going to be frustrated at you for even doing X because you didn't verify that that was actually the problem that needed to be solved. So maybe this frankly brings up the aspect of like, I guess whatever we choose to do as a beginner, are we actually arming ourselves with the proper tools and knowledge so that we jump in with that foundation in place?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, on this same note, like when that type of thing happens, when a leader says, go build this thing, it's a sign of how healthy the company culture is if you have the ability as a product manager to bring back evidence and say, hey, I'm looking at, what the customer is saying, what the market is saying, what the data is saying, and maybe this product isn't right for us. Here's a different idea. Like, if that's not something you feel like you could do in your role as a product manager, then that's a signal that maybe the culture is not a good fit for you. Um, and it's something, I've heard about and seen. I think product managers take orders from other people all the time. I think it's about gut checking and figuring out whether it's actually
Yeah.
going to work or not. Because even if it wasn't your idea, if you build it, it's your fuck up.
Yeah, and of course,
That's a
like you
good
said,
mantra.
it matters
Yeah.
on that company's culture for sure. Because in some places it's just like, okay, you just got to do what you've been asked, but a sign of a good team is usually when they're willing to hear back feedback from the market and customers,
Right.
and then iterate based on that.
Yeah. And I mean, the concept of iterating is very beginner's mind too, right? Like learning new things with each version. The idea that you're not going to build something that's going to last forever. Like software is malleable and is going to continuously transform as you continue to work on it, as the customer uses it in a different way, as the devices that we access it through change, right? It's all present moment as it develops. So you need to be able to learn as you go there.
Yeah. Nick, what are you picking up from all this?
Well, so I mean, I think you guys are coming up with, correct my language, I think both of you, trying not to say you guys, trying to lead by example. I think both of you are coming up with a framework here really for getting into present moment or getting into beginner's mind. They might be synonyms. Were we all familiar with the kleshas?
Yeah, a little bit.
So the kleshas, this is really what I'm hearing the two of you talk about. And the kleshas are the afflictions that get in the way of our happiness and really in the way of our presence. And there's 5 of them. And one is ignorance. So kind of like, you don't know what you don't know, right? We think we know, right? We have a veil. The next one is attachment, which I've heard you both talk about in terms of like, this is who I am. This is who my identity is. This is what I do. The third, aversion, right? Like a resistance to change or a resistance to trying because we're afraid of failure. We're afraid of being seen as less than. Then there's ego, right? This is who Nick is. This is what Nick does. Or, this is what Nitin does. This is how he is. And the last one is then fear, and I guess what I'm hearing you both talk about is we need to remove those as much as possible. So Laura, I'm wondering for you, like, out of the kleshas, which one feels like the biggest lever that we can pull to stay fresh? And I've heard that's what the word I was coming to mind earlier as you were talking of, like a freshness, like fresh ears, fresh eyes, like fresh perspective, and not being the expert. So I'm wondering what out of the kleshas, and I'm now bringing like a yogic philosophy into your product management world, because I think that's the language we all speak here, is, but what, which one of those is the biggest lever you think we can pull to get more present, to get more in that beginner space?
I feel like attachments and aversions are just two sides of the same coin. So maybe that's two answers and that's cheating, but attachments and aversions, I think, are the biggest ones of, I am somebody who does things a certain way. I'm attached to that process and I avoid discomfort. I think aversion to discomfort is a huge one. Like, comfort in ambiguity is a big skill for a product manager, but also anyone who's new trying something, it's going to be pretty uncomfortable for a while. And if your goal in life is to go through it avoiding discomfort, what kind of life is that going to lead you to?
It
That's
could be
a powerful question.
But complacent.
But that's a powerful question. Can you repeat that question, Laura?
Just, if your goal in life is to avoid discomfort, what type of life is that going to lead to? I think about comfort with surfing a lot because it's objectively extremely uncomfortable. Like freezing water, strong rip currents. The best time of the year to go in is actually in the middle of the winter. Who would have thought? You think surfing is a summer sport. Actually, the tides are better in fall and winter in the Northern Hemisphere. But, objectively, it's super uncomfortable. It's not that enjoyable, like from a physical perspective, except for that moment of electricity when you're on the wave. And so if I were doing like a cost benefit analysis of my time surfing, it'd be like, I spend 3 hours in the water and I'm on a wave for maybe 5 minutes on a really good day with long waves. So if my goal was to avoid discomfort, that exercise would not yield to me surfing. It's like, I think also one beat that both of you have mentioned at different points is the idea of time, and how in sort of a corporate world, we think of time as money or energy and needing time to be productive. I think there's this sort of counterintuitive thing around when I'm in beginner's mind, I don't have the expectation that my time is productive. And asking someone to spend time unproductive is like, maybe your PM senses are going to be giving you an allergic reaction to like, go be unproductive.
Or someone's perfectionist tendency is going to get triggered, at a red alert. Okay. Release the goal of being productive here. Release the goal of being good. Yeah.
Yeah, and that brings up, huge topics actually, just around like the role of learning and like the time it takes to invest into learning something. And often, the rewards don't come right away. There's persistence involved. And really, if there's one question I take away from this conversation, is probably the one you just asked, Laura, which is if the goal is in life is to avoid discomfort, then what kind of life does that end up creating? Because usually, I was just reflecting on that as you said that, is every time I feel I've actually leaned into something that was uncomfortable and taken that first tiny step. So yes, something I'm aiming towards might be really ridiculously discomforting, but then decomposing it, taking the first tiny step in that direction, and then continuing to take the next small step after that, the next small step after that. That's usually what's made it easier for at least me to lean into the discomfort. But it's often when I have chosen to lean into the discomfort that growth happens, a sense of accomplishment occurs. I start to define life on my own terms rather than just being comfortable with wherever I was. Because if I had just tried to stay comfortable, it would have also been a pretty boring and frankly dissatisfying life if I hadn't actually leaned into a lot of the things that made me uncomfortable.
and you probably wouldn't have formed as many memories.
Mm-hmm. Many memories, many friendships.
Yeah.
I just love the softness that I'm hearing in your voice, and it's in around growth. Because I think there's this picture out there in the world that growth is uncomfortable, or growth is scary, or taking leaps, is dangerous. It's like, it can be, but it also doesn't have to be. There is a world where you have a plan. You go, okay, here's what I want to do. I want to learn to surf. It's going to be hard. It's going to be challenging. I'm going to get outside my comfort zone. How do I start right now? Okay, well, I need to watch some videos, take one step. And then what I find is one step in the present moment leads to, let's say, for lack of a better word, a better step in the next moment. When we're more present in this moment, our next steps usually tend to go better. And then all of a sudden we go, whoa, how did I become successful? How did I become happy? How did I become joyful? Well, because you've been present all along the way, and all of those steps, one after another, have led to a very big goal, a very big achievement, a very big accomplishment. And I think that's so important to remember, that we can build towards great goals and great lives in a very systematic and sustainable way that doesn't have to, dismantle our entire realities. We can, there's going to be times and places for that, but we really can sustainably grow and change. And even with hard things, progress and persistence and patience, that's how we get to the end, those pieces, patience, persistence, showing up, finding good coaches, finding good friends to support us. I think those are all part of the frameworks too.
Yeah. And I just love this where we've ended up with this conversation, which is just, to me, it's almost wanting to feel, it's brought this new perspective of, okay, even if I'm doing something that I've always been doing for a while, how can I probably keep a little bit of that beginner's mindset still with me? Because that's what feeds the growth. It feeds excitement, learning something new, being able to bring fresh ideas to the table, right? And then at the same time, all right, well, if I got this next crazy audacious goal, which in the current moment may feel uncomforting, if that's a word, and breaking it down to like, what's our next little step, in that direction. It's probably, at least for me, that's what seems to be like the largest takeaway from our call here today is, how can we keep that beginner's mindset, lean in with some level of comfort, break down the large milestones into smaller chunks so that it's exciting and create some sense of like, oh yeah, it's not, as daunting as we thought it was, whatever the goal might be.
Yeah. And I think a good way to check in with yourself if you are approaching it with a beginner's mind is if it seems too easy, like if it seems overly simple. The designer I work with and I have a running joke of like, if it seems too simple, you're missing something. So if it seems too easy, you're not paying attention. There's something going on maybe that you're not experiencing or listening to that could offer more to you in the moment.
Or there isn't that bit that would actually lean into just that tiny bit of next growth that's needed so that it's continuing to actually help you get better at whatever it is you're doing. Right? So if you've been practicing on the land, maybe it's time to throw in some water.
Yes. Or if you've been practicing in 2-foot waves, maybe it's time for something a little steeper or faster braking, or,
Yeah, just go join the Maverick, all in.
Yeah, that's going to be that's my goal.
Or if you're addicted to being the best at something you've never done, like me, then pick something that doesn't have a goal. That's so. I think that can be fun as well. Go up. I think what I'm hearing to say is go up against our tendencies, right? Whatever your tendency is, go the opposite direction. Go against the grain. So cool.
They call surfing a lifetime sport for a reason. Is you can do it for your whole life and still be learning. So I appreciate that.
Always a beginner.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. Laura, thoughts, insights to leave us with before we close this conversation out? It's been fun. Thank you very much for coming on and for sharing. And I think you knocked it out of the park on your first podcast on the way to an eventual TED Talk, by the way.
Yeah. Is that the goal,
Yeah, sounds
Laura?
good. If I don't get an invitation to TED, then this podcast was a failure. So yes.
We'll work
No,
at
I'm
it.
just kidding.
This was your first decomposed milestone.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah, closing thoughts. I think, you can apply beginner's mind to anything, whether it's work, how you show up in your relationships, or something that you do just for fun. If you are on the wheel of time is money is energy, I would really recommend doing something where you can decouple your productivity and your time, because it's super refreshing and helps your brain just recharge. At least that's my experience.
Love that piece. Love that piece. All right. Well, Laura, we'll put some notes in the show. People can kind of track you down, maybe on LinkedIn, find you, and get you on their podcast, get you signed up for a TED Talk. And thanks so much for jumping on. That was a ton of fun. Really appreciate your time and energy and your presence.
Yeah, thank you both. That was super fun.
All right.